the record that played forgotten days. Orielle and her little brother Tavish had spent the whole gray Saturday morning carrying dusty boxes down from their grandmother's attic, ever since she had decided the old house was finally too big for just herself. Every box seemed to hold something Orielle had never known existed: chipped teacups, yellowed letters, a single mitten with no partner, and every single one made the house feel a little less like theirs. Tavish, only 7, mostly thought the whole thing was a treasure hunt, but Orielle, 3 years older, understood exactly what packing up an entire house actually meant. She had learned to walk in this house, had hidden under this very attic's slanted roof during 100 games of hide-and-seek, and none of that seemed to matter to the moving boxes at all. By midday, her arms ached, and her chest felt heavier than any of the boxes she had carried. Pushing aside a stack of moth-eaten quilts, Tavish uncovered an old wooden trunk none of them remembered ever seeing before, its brass latches gone green with age. Inside, wrapped carefully in a faded velvet cloth, sat a small record player with a wide brass horn, and beside it, a single record with no label at all, just smooth black grooves. "It's probably broken," Orielle said, blowing a thick layer of dust off the brass horn, though her fingers were already tracing the crank on its side with real curiosity. Tavish, never one to leave a mystery alone, begged her to try it anyway, just once, before they carried it down to the donation pile with everything else. Orielle wound the crank slowly, set the needle down with careful fingers, and held her breath as the old machine crackled to life. No music came out of the brass horn at all. Instead, a young woman's laughter filled the attic, bright and clear, followed by a voice unmistakably their grandmother's, only decades younger. "If you drop that box of ribbons one more time, Frances, I'm sewing your sleeves shut," the young voice laughed, followed by another woman's giggling protest that neither child recognized. Orielle and Tavish stared at each other, then at the softly spinning record, both too startled to speak for a long moment. The recording lasted only a minute or two before crackling into silence again, leaving the attic feeling somehow warmer than it had all morning. Neither of them had ever heard their grandmother sound quite so young, so unguarded, so entirely unlike the careful, quiet woman downstairs who always remembered everyone's tea order. Curious, Tavish wound the crank again straight away, certain they would hear the exact same recording a second time. Instead, an entirely different memory crackled out, their grandmother's voice again, older this time, humming a lullaby to a crying baby who could only have been their own mother. Every single time they played it, a different forgotten day drifted out of the brass horn, never repeating, as though the record somehow knew exactly which memory the attic most needed to remember before it was cleared away for good. Orielle, forgetting all about the boxes still waiting to be carried downstairs, sat cross-legged on the dusty floor and asked Tavish to wind it one more time. Tavish, delighted to have found something far better than any donation pile, wound the crank so eagerly that Orielle had to steady his hands to keep the needle from scratching. They ran downstairs together, breathless, and half-dragged their grandmother up the narrow attic stairs before she could ask a single question about what all the fuss was for. When the record crackled to life with her own laughter from more than 50 years ago, their grandmother pressed one trembling hand over her mouth and sat down hard on the nearest closed box. "That was my father's record player," she said softly, once she could speak again. "And Frances was my very best friend the summer before she moved away forever." She had not thought of Frances, she admitted, in longer than she could clearly remember, And hearing her own voice from that particular summer made the whole attic feel suddenly strangely full again. Orielle watched her grandmother's face carefully, unsure whether the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes were the sad kind or the happy kind, and decided, after a moment, that they were probably both at once. But the new apartment, their grandmother reminded them gently, had barely enough room for her favorite armchair, let alone an old record player that was probably more trouble than it was worth. "It's just an old broken thing, really," she said, already reaching to wrap it back in its velvet cloth for the donation pile, the same way she had spoken about a dozen other treasures that morning. Orielle felt something tighten in her chest at the thought of it disappearing into a stranger's attic somewhere, carrying every single one of those forgotten days along with it. She looked at Tavish, who was already opening his mouth to protest loudly, and quickly decided a better argument than tears was needed. Grandmother was already reaching for a strip of packing tape, humming distractedly, the record player half-wrapped and only moments from disappearing into the donation pile for good. Instead of arguing, Orielle quietly wound the crank one final time and set the needle down herself, holding her breath along with everyone else in the attic. This time, a man's warm, unfamiliar voice crackled out, singing off-key to a newborn baby, and their grandmother's breath caught sharply at the very first note. "That's your grandfather," she whispered, tears finally spilling over. "The night your mother was born, right in this house, right in that very corner." She reached out and took the record player gently into her own lap, holding it the way she might have once held that newborn baby herself. Tavish, quiet for once, simply leaned against her shoulder and listened as the off-key singing crackled softly onto its very last note. There was, it turned out, exactly enough room in one small moving box for a record player wrapped carefully in velvet, tucked between two folded blankets for safekeeping. It meant leaving one lamp and a slightly wobbly side table behind instead, a trade their grandmother agreed to without a single moment of hesitation. Their grandmother wrote, "Do not donate," across the box in thick black marker, twice, just to be absolutely certain, and Tavish added a small drawing of a smiling brass horn beside her words. Orielle carried that particular box to the van herself, refusing every offer of help, as though carrying it carefully mattered every bit as much as the memories crackling somewhere inside it. She promised them both that the small new apartment would fill up with its own forgotten days soon enough, one crackling memory at a time, exactly the way this house had. As they finally carried the last box down to the moving van, Tavish looked back up at the empty attic and asked, quite seriously, whether the record player would remember today too, dust and all. The attic, stripped bare of boxes at last, looked smaller and plainer than Orielle had ever seen it, as if it too were waiting to see what would happen to all its old, quiet corners. Their grandmother laughed, a real, bright laugh that sounded exactly like the one still crackling somewhere inside that old brass horn, and said she certainly hoped so. "Every ordinary Saturday turns into somebody's forgotten day eventually," she said, tucking one last box into the van, "which means you two had better start behaving memorably." Orielle slipped her hand into her grandmother's as they walked down the front path one last time, deciding that a house could be left behind far more easily than the days that had happened inside it.